Hello Rebel and welcome back to my life. So now every once in a while I get a little bit bummed out because I get this feeling like I've kind of run out of things to say, whether it's on a YouTube video or like in a weekly email to my email list. I just am sort of like, what do I talk about? And then I start to wonder if I'm out of things to talk about. Like, have I talked about all of the important things that I am going to talk about in this life? Am I just out of topics on which I have opinions? Well, this happened a few days ago, and then Hank Green tweeted, "Is Game of Thrones a science fiction show?" And it turned out I had opinions. At the top of the video, I'd just like to say that I'm referring in this whole talk to both Game of Thrones, the TV show, and A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series upon which the TV show is based. So let's sort it out once and for all. Let's establish the definitive answer. Is Game of Thrones a science fiction story? No, it is not. I guess that's the video. No. Okay, let's break down exactly why Game of Thrones is not science fiction. It just isn't. The best argument for Game of Thrones being a science fiction story is that a bunch of stuff in the show doesn't make sense and doesn't seem to be physically possible, but could have a scientific explanation if you try hard enough. A primary example is the seasons. Like in Game of Thrones, seasons take much longer than a season. You know, the 3 months that seasons take on Earth. Summers and winters can last for years, or even in some extreme cases, entire lifetimes. And the length of the seasons varies season to season. And you could explain this with a really weird axial tilt on the planet that Game of Thrones takes place on. Like, not only is the tilt different from how it is on Earth, but that the tilt actually wobbles a little bit, so that if it wobbles in just the right way, you get a winter that lasts for longer than a human lifetime. Then you could say things like, well, the dragons are genetically engineered bioweapons that were designed to only be controllable by the Targaryens, who were genetically modified to have some sort of special psychic link to the dragons, and the last vestige of that is their silver hair. These are cool headcanons. There's no doubt about it. Like, the implications of that and the idea that that could be true is really cool. It just isn't in the books or the show. Science fiction has to have the science fiction be part of the fiction. If there is no hope or promise within the canon itself that these things are or can be explained by science, then it's not science fiction. And granted, not every science fiction story delves into the mechanics of how these things could be possible. Like, lots of science fiction stories have light speed travel, and they don't explain how it works, they just say that it exists. But that is still presented as a new, unique, and interesting thing, specifically because it relates to what we think we already know about science, which is that light speed travel is essentially impossible. And Game of Thrones specifically says that all of these weird phenomena, including the Walking Dead and creating fire out of nowhere, are magical in nature. The canon says that it is a fantasy story because it is based on magic. And all of these ideas about how it could actually be science fiction are just fans coming up with headcanons. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with alternate universe fan fiction that puts a story into an entirely different genre. That's one of the most transformative things you can do as a fan fiction creator. But that does not mean that Game of Thrones itself is science fiction. And George R. R. Martin has made some comments about ways that these things could work in a scientific way, but again, if it's not in the work, it doesn't change the genre. Because if a couple of comments by George R. R. Martin make his stories science fiction, despite the fact that those comments are not represented in the books at all, then the Harry Potter series is great queer representation because of J.K. Rowling's comments. And it's not. If it's not in the story itself, it doesn't count. To which the counter argument could be made, well, these things aren't explicitly in the book, but they can be inferred from what we do know to be happening in the story. And if you want to go with that explanation, then yes, Game of Thrones can be placed within the science fiction genre, as long as the word genre just doesn't mean anything anymore. In which case, I would love to make some literary recommendations to you. First of all, I think that you should check out the excellent epic fantasy story I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. And yes, I know a lot of the uneducated think that I, Robot is a science fiction story, but we have no scientific explanation for the creation of artificial intelligence in an artificial construct. So obviously magic is at play here. It's actually an epic fantasy. I would also love to recommend to you one of my favorite science fiction stories, the Jack Reacher books by Lee Childs. Oh sure, plebeians might categorize the Jack Reacher books as thrillers, but there is no physical way that a human body can withstand as much punishment as Jack Reacher's does. Clearly some genetic experimentation has been going on with this guy. Obviously it's the only possible explanation. Jack Reacher is definitely science fiction. Ridiculous examples aside, and they are ridiculous. actually the best explanation for why Game of Thrones does not fall in the genre of science fiction whatsoever has to do with why genres were invented in the first place. Because people forget that genres haven't existed as long as stories have existed. Genres are a relatively recent human construct. And the purpose of genre, and some people are gonna hate me for saying this, is marketing. Genre is a marketing tool. It is a way that you can hopefully attract readers to stories published in the form of books, films, or whatever, by promising that your story is somewhat like these other stories that they may enjoy. You know how on Amazon they have that little bar on every page that says customers who bought this item also bought this other thing? The invention of the idea of genres is the earliest version of Amazon's also bought bar. When you walk into a bookstore, Barnes & Noble or your local indie bookshop, please shop local indies, and you see all those bookshelves laid out and they have little signs on top of each bookshelf saying what genre those books are in, those signs are ads. They are a little signpost saying, hey, you're the kind of person who likes dragons in your stories, and if you come over into this section of the store, we've got a bunch of books that probably have dragons in them. And if someone came up to you, some total stranger who you had no previous idea or contact with, and said, I want to read or watch a science fiction story, you would never recommend Game of Thrones. And if you did recommend it, that person would look at the cover of the book or the trailer of the show and say, that is not at all what I asked for. And if you somehow gave them the book without the cover or the show without the trailer and they read it or watched it, they would be very upset with you because they asked for something very specific and you did not give it to them. Genre is an invented and mostly arbitrary division of things into categories by which people can find other similar things. It was created for marketing. It was created to sell more products. That's what it is. And by that definition, and by basically any other way that you could think about it, I'm sorry, but no, Game of Thrones is not science fiction. That's all I've got for you today, Rebel. On the off chance this is your first time seeing one of my videos, I want to remind you that you can pick up a free copy of my #1 Amazon bestseller, a fantasy novel called Nightblade, link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons who are scrolling below my face for their incredible support, and I will see you next Friday. Bye!